My name is Ann Weidlich. I'm here interviewing Dean Bowles, and it must be July 28th or something, 2019. And we're going to start with a little story about Marge Elliott and Dean Bowles, and take it from there.
Well, Marge, I knew, was very active. Did a lot of what you were doing, Monona History, but she was also kind of an amateur poet.
Yes.
And I think I still have a couple of her poems in the thing. And she was the first woman on the Monona City Council, which were really made up of, I guess you'd call it an old guard males. And I kind of recognize that too. But they were the founders. And it was an interesting bunch because from that group they had a vision of a city, and it's interesting that people who I don't think of one of them really had any kind of university or background that would lead them to want a library, but one of the things they did was to have a library, and that was before this building was built. And the library was in the room in the community center that is nearest to the park there. And the fellow who ran the baited ice cream shop was the librarian. And it was so it was an interesting
Informal?
Well, it was a real library start, but they wanted to build a community, and the parks and the library and it was a part of, not these people particularly, was also a part of that movement that created the Monona Grove School District in the early 50s. Madison was searching to expand widely, and at the time the area of this side of the lake that is now La Follette and going east now quite a ways was not Madison School District, and they sought to attach Monona and particularly pick up the value of the tank farms in down in
Toward McFarland.
in McFarland there. They failed in McFarland, they failed to attach Monona. But about simultaneously to that, or there was clearly a state law once Madison attached that, is that what about the schools now? Should the schools be a part? Because part of the school district? No, Monona is going to have its own schools. And so they succeeded in surviving as a municipality, and they succeeded in surviving with the elementary school, which is where the district office is today, up on Monona Drive. And but the law said you had to have a operating high school. And so how are they going to get the high school? And I think you know the history of the acquisition of the land, which is at the high school.
Right.
There.
Fire department.
Well, it was, I kind of forget what it was, but it was a privately owned piece of land, which, so that piece of land, which is now the high school, was annexed into Monona because it was a part of the cottage, a part of Blooming Grove at the time. And so, of course, today it's surrounded on three sides by the city of Madison, including the little shopping center there. And but then, so to give you a kind of a figure, it wasn't the city fathers, but it was kind of the Monona spirit, was to well, how do you support and justify a school district that has one high school, an elementary school, and potentially a very small self-contained population, and have a quality school system? The issue was the incorporation of Cottage Grove into the school system. That gets away from the city issues, and I've been told, I have no idea if it's factual, but they had so little money in the first part that the school board at that time took out private loans to pay the teachers their first salaries or two, and they probably got paid back, but that sort of thing. But anyway, that's a part of the history or mythology of the school district. But it's also an extension of the development of this city before I arrived here. And but when I arrived here, there was clearly an identity of we and them being Madison.
And that was in 1966, I believe.
Right, I arrived in '66 from California, and out there I grew up in Southern California in areas of Pasadena and Alhambra and that sort of thing. And one time I lived in sight of the Rose Bowl, and never went to a Rose Bowl game till I moved to Wisconsin because it was very easy to buy those Rose Bowl tickets, because us junior high school kids would wait in line, and our parents would bring us food, so we camped out over a couple of nights because tickets would go on sale at 9 o'clock on Monday morning or something, and we could all buy 4 tickets. And I never got to a Rose Bowl game, nor did my parents, because I'll use the slander of there was always some they were always playing some other team, something that wasn't all Big Ten at that time, but I'll say that they would meet some hick from Wisconsin that would give us $20 for a $5 ticket. And so at the Rose Parade, because we often camped out at the Rose Parade as a family overnight, and so we had tickets right on the curb, in a good place. So I grew up there and went to high school there, and got into Yale from there, and met my wife from New Jersey, and came back to California, and I taught at high school, Whittier High School in California, and then I worked and finished my PhD, and one of my professors happened to also be in the California State Assembly, and California was going to be the second state to have professional staff their committees. They did this in the assembly, and he says if I apply, he could make sure to get me one of the assignments, and I did, and so I became this first staff member for the California Assembly Education Committee, and worked there for a couple of years, and finished up my PhD, and
then you got looking for a job.
And then I looked around for a job, and I could stay in California, or I could go to Chicago, or a lot of jobs were very relatively easy then, and New York or Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin worked out to be the best place to live and do what I wanted to do. So we moved here in '66, drove across the country with our kids, and never thought flat would end from Montana to the Mississippi River.
It doesn't.
And
then why did you choose to live in Monona as opposed to somewhere else, quote, in Madison?
Well, my wife and I came here when I was interviewed, and we looked around, and my name was Dean Bowles, and they thought I was a dean. So they took me over to the expensive neighborhoods in, the two little...
Tacoma and
yeah, right.
University Heights.
Yeah, and that sort of thing. And so I told them that was my real name, and I didn't need to spend that much on. And but they didn't they didn't have the Monona houses in the same book. So I said, what is this? I looked at a map. I said, what is this? McFarland and Middleton and Monona. And so so my wife and I looked, and we looked at 2 houses were on the street where we lived, and then I came back for a second interview, and I actually decided between the 2 houses and bought the house we have, and so there's the story.
Right.
And then my property backs up. I have 8 neighbors because the properties on Winnequa are relatively narrow property, so I had them. And the mayor then was one of the properties that backed up, Marvin Schumacher. It backed up to our property, and we got to know each other. And he says, ever think about doing something for the city? And I said, well, sure, why not? So, a few months later, he says, how about being on the library board? So that was my first assignment, and I got a little more involved and met people and got involved in the hockey association. I started that with a couple other people for the kids and everything.
Ice hockey.
Ice hockey, and so my son was growing into that age and everything, and so an election came around. It was probably 4 years or 5, 6 years later. I don't remember when I was first elected. Do you?
Yes, I believe it was 73.
Yeah, well, we came here in 66, and so I was probably on the library board for three or 4 years, and then in one of the elections, Marge got elected. It was in her first 2-year term, and
This is Marge Elliott.
Marge Elliott, and she kind of walked with a cane and a limp, but she went door to door, and she was a missionary type of thing. She wasn't a hardcore feminist, but she was, but she recognized, she became more of a feminist with the old guard, and the old guard worked at Giddings and Lewis, which is a machine factory on Washington Street, and they worked at Oscar Mayer and those kind of things. And I said, these mill and factory workers had a dream of this city, and so I can give them a lot of credit. But they were a gang of guys, and finally she limped up to my door when she was campaigning and said to me, why don't you run? She didn't come up saying, vote for me, because she figured I probably would. But she said, I need somebody, nobody will second anything for it. I need a second. So I might give it a thought and ran and won. So I got on the city council, and I learned a lot about Monona from listening and talking to people. And the volunteer fire department is not as volunteer anymore.
No.
And but then it was all volunteers, and for many years, and they're very proud of their volunteer fire department. And then about the time I got in there, they started a ambulance service. They had an ambulance service, which was really station wagons and not ambulances. Mm-hmm. And so they put people in the back of station wagons, and that happened. We still had station wagons. I think I got the first ambulances when I was mayor, but one of the founders of the city, who was kind of the acting city administrator, he was the city administrator, and I forget his name now, but he was part of the volunteer fire department. And one of the problems that the city had, and the benefits it had, were all these people were dreamers and doing stuff, but they were all inbred, and they were not professional in a lot of things they did, budgeting and taxing and that sort of thing. And they thought those station wagons were just as good. And I was the first one that hired a professional outside city administrator, a young fellow who had an internship down in one of the suburbs of Chicago. And that was, I think, kind of a breakthrough, and we've had city administrators ever since, and that sort of thing. And I think that city administrator, I think, even helped deliver a child that was on the way, the mother was on the way to the hospital. I think it was his wife, I think it was. Anyway, but what I found, when I got on the finance committee, which was the place where real decisions were made on the city council, I got on the finance committee, I found it very interesting because when they had to borrow money, nobody was dealing with the banks that made loans were not like the local state banks, the big loans, that sort of thing, like the Monona Grove State Bank and that sort of thing. You had to get these long-term loans for building roads and libraries and things like that from basically Chicago or Milwaukee Bank. And what I noticed is that there was no dealing with Madison banks. And I said, why aren't we dealing with Madison banks? And the annexation fight was still, because the banks were on the Madison side of that, and were financing the Madison annexations, and it was still, we'd have nothing to do with Madison. We don't want their transportation, their buses. We don't want their water.
We don't want their money.
And we don't even want their money. And so at that time, I don't think it made a lot of difference, but it was a part of.
So raw and sore.
Right, and so I got on the city council, and we needed some. We just needed to continue progress on it, and one of the things we had was the state came up with a statute that the city could not continue its financing the way it always had been, which I won't get into all the details of it, but it was in the long run, it was not a healthy financial arrangement, and the state prohibited it. So suddenly we needed money, and and I don't know the amount, but I think we had to increase the revenue from the city by about 50%.
Tax revenue?
Yeah, tax revenue, and we had to run a referendum and get it done, and it got 2/3, which tells you a little bit about Monona and that sort of thing. And also the emergence of the senior center came about because I had another woman on the city council. Oh God, she was Miss Democratic. She was very involved with the Democratic Party. She lived up on Monona Drive. You got me some names of the background there? And she slips my mind now, but it's I know we had an 80th birthday for her one time when she was here, because we had the party up in the community
center. It's
center.
not Dorothy Haynes.
No, not Dorothy Haynes.
And not Waldarzik?
Yeah, Rita Waldarzik, that's it.
Oh, he was the Rita Waldarzik, okay.
Yeah. So I see her daughter every once in a while, but I'm sorry I forgot her name. But she made the connections with the East Madison senior centers and began probing for a senior center here. And we didn't have a full-fledged one to begin with, but we ended up having a designation of it and got it going. And during her time, she did all the work. I just supported her and that sort of thing. But the library had been built right when we came here, And the library won a state architectural design, as I told you in the last one. But like most architects, nobody asked a librarian what a library should look like. And my wife is a librarian, and she went through a building program because she was a librarian in one of the distant suburbs, and nobody was asking her. They had some woman on the city council who was a postal clerk, and she was designing the library there in Cambridge. Cambridge was the city. And but just to go to that library, the way it looks today is has only a skeletal semblance of what it was, because it's had about 3 major operations. And in fact, one of the operations was you go in the side door over here off the street, and you go in there where well, we're in it, aren't we? And well, if you go downstairs where we were just a few minutes ago, you could walk in that side door, and what there was a fireplace, overstuffed furniture, and a couch, and that was designed for people to come in at any time of the day and sit and read, enjoy themselves. And but the librarians were still having a fuss because the books were all coming in downstairs, that they still do, and in the library it was always upstairs, and the elevator was always broken down, and you know, so it was never no one quite knew what to do with the downstairs. So and they really don't today. You have a lot of wasted space down there, really, and they had the theater room there. That could have been expanded earlier on, but there's a lot of vacant space, 2 small washrooms, a boardroom in there, and that sort of thing. But it was but I think that plagued every city council that was there. But there's always some major thing to do. Finally, when Tom Metcalf was mayor, he kind of took a hold of it and got a bigger referendum, big $3 million referendum through, and I helped him on that, and then they did the library as it is today. It was the result of that referendum, and it did a lot to overcome the hardships that we had and so forth. But so that's a lot of my era. We had I told you about we had the state changed the funding law, and when I was mayor, and we had to raise the tax rate, I think 60%.
Right.
And
Well,
and I had to do it, and we got it through because we just made a massive campaign, and we didn't have any real organized opposition to it, but there's resistance at 60%. Anyway.
My theory is you get what you pay for. And if you want services, if you want to be a good functioning city, you need to pay.
Well, we did what most local governments do, you blame it on the state.
Well, there's that.
There's some little bit of truth to that, but.
Right.
And but had we not done it, was the state law that really put us in the position. But the state law was long term the right thing to do, and but it showed how the city in the long term had been improperly financed, and they were when I inherited, they were doing a lot of borrowing off of the water fund and stuff like things like that, kind of.
I understand that you also encouraged citizen participation in committees and
I broadened
boards.
I broadened that. I started the thing that you're playing. I started the committee on the history of Monona. I forget what we called the name of the committee back then. Do you remember?
No.
It was Tom Altenberg was the first chair of it.
The Monona Landmarks Commission.
Yeah, Landmarks Commission. That was what we started, and because that was supposed to be the history, but its an early mission was to identify key objects and buildings that were to be done. And I remember Tom, was a student of mine at the university, was a principal at I think in Sun Prairie, and I told Tom it's only going to be 2 or 3 or 4 months, and then get the thing on it. And I think he was a couple of years at it, and he still reminds me of it when I've seen him. And so that became the history commission of Monona that everybody got involved with. I thought it was going to be about a 3-year thing to do landmarks, and it would fade away. Had done its job, but like most things in government, it finds other purposes and keeps going.
Right.
And
then the South Beltline highway was a big issue at your time.
And I wasn't mayor when it was actually built, but I was the mayor when the final resolution of it was gotten by it, and it was interesting because Governor Lee Sherman Dreyfus was the governor at the time. The highway, everybody knew the highway. Well, you can see what it is now. It's even the highway you got out there now is starting to strain the development that's now. But that was going down Monona Drive.
Right, and out Broadway.
No, it's Broadway. Yeah, excuse me. Yeah, Broadway, and the development of Broadway and the shopping center where Shopko went out of existence was basically a field, and that was the old airport there at one time, and not when I was there, but at another time. That's a bit of my background too. I'm a pilot. I flew for about 20 years and so forth. My son flies and everything and so forth, but there was a lot going on, and it was always at a low level, but nothing was going to be done until a highway department, state highway people, or the governor was going to make it an issue. And Madison was needing. It was the big irony there in Madison is that some of the opposition came from the current state senator there, who's been there forever.
Oh, Risser.
And because his house, he lives in across Lake Monona, and his house is on the right over the hill from the Beltline. But he got a temporary solution to that, where they built what I call Mount Risser today. There's a huge earthen mound along the current highway there. As you go in, you begin to start the turn into the Coliseum area, and they expanded that. That solved his problem a bit. But he became then he was then appealing to with the environmentalist in Madison and that sort of thing. I was sympathetic to it, and we had one, which Marge Elliott was the leader of that in Monona, and there was heavy opposition to it on environmental grounds. In Madison, there was a little bit in Monona, but the highway, but the future of Monona and any transportation was going to rested on building that highway. And so Governor Earl was later the Democratic governor, is that he was appointed the Secretary of Environment by who was this, the governor I just mentioned? Dreyfus. So he was and I knew Earl through Democratic politics, and Dreyfus wanted to get things done, and so they had the right mayor in me that I think that would kind of negotiate it. Monona was probably split between people who were environmentalists and people who wanted the highway and so forth. But one of the things that really turned it was the wife of Chuck Qualla. Senator Qualla got killed at the intersection of Broadway and Bridge Road by one of these animal trucks going through the intersection and hitting her and killing her. And I don't know if she was killed or badly injured, I believe. And anyway, history fades a little bit. But that was it, and but it moved along, and there was the environmentalist groups were saying how much marsh was going to be there. People who had a history in Monona said those marshes are artificial anyway. They were planted there, and it's the old timers kind of knew how they were built. I don't know if that was factual or not, and because facts didn't always add up to much anyway. And finally it got down to a deal where we were saying, look, this is destroying 22.5 acres of marshland, and I forget who mentioned it to me. It wasn't my idea, but I promoted it. Is that why don't we just put another 25 acres of marshland someplace else? And so I just made the promotion to the state people in one of these committee meetings. I said, what happens? How much would it cost to plant 22.5 acres of new marshland? So and so somebody said, I think $20,000 to do it, and so I went back and added $20,000 to the city budget, and we added 22.5 acres of marshland. I don't know if that was the final deal, but it all happened right about then that it got done.
That's my understanding of how it got finally off the ground.
And I think it was a $22,000, if I recall. You can check the facts. I remember $22,000 it cost us in the budget anyway to
drop in the bucket
to do that. And Senator Risser wasn't very. At that time, he was playing Mr. Environmentalist. He got his sound burn for him, and he was doing it, but they all came together on it. And it happened. It wasn't built when I was there, but it was built about 2 or 3 years later. But.
Right, and then why did you run for mayor particularly?
Oh, I thought the city needed modernization, and I saw that the financing was there. They were tending to focus too much on. They had a focus on roads, and the biggest controversies every year were how much miles of road you're going to have, and they were very pleased with themselves and what they had, and they'd done a lot. They built a swimming pool, they built a community center, a library, a city hall, and so their vision of the city, I think, had ended, and so kind of modern management came in. I brought in the first professional city manager, and he was an intern city manager from one of the little suburbs of Chicago, and I brought him in, and he did a great job, and then he went on to be city manager for a large southern city later on, and we ended up getting ambulances and not. In fact, that city manager, I think, was the guy who delivered the child in one of these old ambulances.
Right.
And so, but I tried to begin to hire people who were less tied to the politics of the volunteer fire department. Our city administrator was the fire chief. He was the one, Ed Lottis, Lotus Park on
Nice.
the Beltline. Ed was part of the people of the vision, but he and a lot of that era were kind of mired 25 years back. In my judgment, I thought they had wonderful vision and doing what they wanted. A lot of the parks you have, they preserve the land and so forth. They're very proud of Winnequa Park from one end to the other, and the other patch parks that are around. That's why Lotus Park was, when he died, we named the park after him down there on the Broadway. When I came in, one of the problems we were having was, how do we professionalize a volunteer fire department that was really a buddy system and a club that people putting in a lot of time, but they were not being retrained and that sort of thing. That's the first act I had to make sure, because when they knew I was elected, they tried to appoint a fire chief before I came in, and I said, if you do that, he's going to be the unfire chief the day I get in. So, and they said, what is the solution? I said, I met with some of the leaders of the fire department. I said, you know what you need? You need a real pro, and you need people that'll keep you volunteers together. And I said, you know who that is? And he was a volunteer fireman who was also a custodian at the Monona Grove schools, and they hired him, and he was it. And I put money into the budget to hire MATC to do some retraining of the firemen and that sort of thing, and they were very happy.
Do you remember his name? I would ask.
Well, yeah, you can look at the date, and when I came in, and he was the fire chief right after that.
Okay.
And he did a very good job, and then I began to do that slowly with the police chief and that sort of thing. So,
Did you also introduce the idea of women into police and fire? Did that come up?
well, I hired a police chief that we know was going to do that, and the fire department would do that as well. I didn't make it a condition of their employment or that, but I remember the push I was getting, because some of the first woman policeman there didn't have a place to change, or a locker, or a place to shower, or anything like that. And I said, if you walk into the city hall, it's been remodeled today, but there was a big kind of large closet. It's probably about a little bit, if you squared off this room, it'd probably be about that size. And he said, there's just no space. I said, that room, I said, run a pipe, put a coat hanger there and a bench. I said, you have the women's. I said, that's going to serve it until you get too many women. And so that was it. And then we had them on the fire department. They were not firemen. They were going with the ambulances, but they were at the same time. And so there was a room upstairs of the fire department there. My recollection, these were where the volunteer firemen and the ambulance people slept. And they were all men, and there were about, if I recall, there were probably 6 or 7 cots for the drivers and the initial people to get the fire engines moving. And so what happens when you have a woman now who's now going to be on the 11 to 7 shift, and you have to be ready to go, and you're sleeping in the fire department along with these men. And I got a lot of phone calls from the wives of the male firemen that I'm going to break up homes and create, sexual promiscuity and all that sort of thing. And I said, well, just call me when it first happens. And but there were probably, if I recall, there were 5 to 8 cots there, and they were, everybody was sleeping ready to go out the door in their fire equipment or their ambulance equipment and so forth. But it was as if it never became a public outcry, but it was as if I was going to break up all this thing through this sexual promiscuity that was going on and everything. So my only thing with the women thing was to get the ambulance. We got the proper ambulances, and then we had, everybody had to be ready to go, and then right about that time, the same time, the police department hired the first woman too, and then she didn't complain to me, but I heard about it, and I said, let's get that done. And I said, you're the police chief, and I said, you just tell me what the cost is, and we'll get the shower and the hook and then get it done. So
I understand you were also involved with senior citizen housing, trying to build some senior citizen housing special.
I don't want to take credit. A lot of things that the council members did, like Rita Wadarsik did with the women's, and we had another young fellow who died very young.
Randy Paul.
Randy Paul did that, and but he was Randy was a very good. He was trying to get Madison City Transit into Monona, which we had for a short time, but their buses were breaking down our streets and not providing good services at an awful cost. Mm-hmm. So it was, but the what were we just talking about?
Senior citizen.
Oh,
housing.
The senior citizen. That was. I supported that, but I didn't initiate it. Rita Wadarsik, who was on our city council, she made the first connections to the East Madison Monona Coalition for Aging, and I believe our seniors went to, before we had a center here, our seniors went to, I wasn't a senior then, I didn't pay much attention to it, so it was some of their other issues, but I thought it was a good idea. So she got that thing going, and that's when we first got a room going for it. And I think they were mostly volunteers then, kind of doing, but not. At least during my time, I don't recall having a senior center director.
Okay. And then you ran for school board. What made you think to move?
Oh, that's quite a bit later.
Yes.
Yeah, that was just. That's been about 5 years ago or something like that. Well, the school board had 2 factions. They still do, and they were one faction was trying to get rid of the superintendent who was there at that time. The other faction was happy with that superintendent, and so. They were having, and one of the problems was the fewer kids in Monona schools, and so the school we're now renting to I'm on the school board now. We're now renting to Madison here. That was being closed down, and so how do we go about that? And but it was mostly clashes of personality related to the superintendent at that time, and it wasn't Madison Cottage, it wasn't Monona Cottage Grove particularly, but it was, you know, there were three of them on the board that you know, anything that superintendent did was wrong, and there were three that was right, that sort of thing, and the interesting thing is when they had a meeting on the closing of Maywood School, and at the meeting where they made the decision to close, I went there and just observed, and they voted 4-3, you know, to close Maywood, and one of the people from one faction came up to me right after the vote and came over to me and says, "Dean, you ought to run for the school board, and we could use you on the school board." And I said, "Oh, God." I said, "I've been on the city council. I've been deputy state superintendent of schools for about 7 years, and so my wife was wanting me to be a little more at home and do other things and so forth." And I said, I'll tell you at noon tomorrow." I said, "Because I got to check it all out with her." And then about 10 minutes later, after the meeting had broken up and I was walking out, one of the leaders of the other faction came up to me and said, "You ought to be out running for the school board. Would you run?" And I said, I didn't tell that person the other one had said anything. And I told them the same thing, though. And neither one of them knew at that point that both sides had asked me. And so I told my wife what happened, and I was afraid to talk with her because city council, I'd been on the state, and I was running around the country and that sort of thing. And so finally I had to broach it to her, you know, and I did it. I told him I would tell him at noon, I think, and I did it at 11 o'clock in the morning. And that was the hardest part. But it was, she said, "Well, if that's something you want to do, and, will it interfere with our travel?" I said, "Oh, we don't travel every week or every month." I said, "We'll do it. We'll just do the travel then and say I can't go." And so I called both factions. Neither one of them knew the other had done it at that time. I had called them both. So I was...
Well, it speaks well, I think, to your ability at negotiating and listening and being open to weighing both sides of a situation. They knew you were a reasonable person. They could maybe reasonably persuade you to their side.
Yeah, well, it's...
Have you been functioning that way, do you think?
Well, I think I am, but I immediately made foes of one of the people because I did not agree with some of it, and that person had the majority on the board at the time and were able to ram their stuff through, whether I supported it from time to time or not. And so I decided to support a switch just to get that, so that alienated the other, you know. So you can win and you don't win, and because when I was supporting one, the other one would say it was a betrayal, you know, and all that sort of thing. But I'm still kind of in that position on the school board.
Well, and you're unique in that you have had such a long background in education and seen it from every angle.
But when you get down there, it doesn't matter. It's all personality and what you did yesterday, you know, or what you did an hour ago.
Right.
You know, it's, well, I've done a lot in education. I was professor at university for 1966 to
99, I think.
In 99, and I worked for an academic year in Finland, Latvia, and in England twice, and teaching and that sort of thing, And then I was deputy superintendent of school, number 2 person there at the DPI for
You got a little bit of experience.
for about six years, I guess. And the state superintendent was my doctoral student at the university.
Right.
So I had a lot of clout in those years and did a lot. Well, one of the things I did when I was the state superintendent is I implemented Title IX throughout the state, which was, the women's thing.
Right.
But once I got into the Title IX, then I would have gays and lesbians come up and say, "What about us?" And then the black community was always there, and so I had about 4 groups that, and finally I put together about a 5-month group to do research around the state as to what the issues are, and it ended up expanding. It wasn't just any group. Everybody was dealing with the same things of access and ability to complain and have their complaints resolved in a reasonable fashion, so I got a new statute written that allows people, like the person didn't like the book in the Monona Grove here of To Kill a Mockingbird. They filed a complaint with the Department of Public Instruction under the statute that I did to complain to what I voted on.
Right.
And so it was,
A lot of serious and very important.
Well, it was, I can tell you a lot of stories. I can tell you 100 stories in 100 different school districts on
Right.
things they were doing to girls and to the gays and lesbians, and or allowing things to happen that overlooked it, and the very first case I had was very first case that came under that new statute and the rules that went with it was the Milton School District had a mascot that it was a kind of a foolish. It was they were the Indians, but it was a kind of a foolish looking Indian with an arrow in his, with not an arrow but a feather in his head that would come out and act like a fool in the field and that sort of thing. And Indian tribes complained on it, and DPI simply said cease and desist and find a more. We have no complaint about the Indian issue. It's how you portray it and that sort of thing, and that was for the Milton schools and right nearby, and so when the To Kill a Mockingbird thing came up, the family filed under the same law that To Kill a Mockingbird was racist, and I found that interesting because To Kill a Mockingbird came out in 1961, and I was a teacher in Whittier, California, and I taught Kill a Mockingbird in 1963, and we had 200 people come to our auditorium to complain about me and other teachers teaching To Kill a Mockingbird. But you know what the complaint was then? It wasn't racist. It was an improper depiction of life in the South. That so it was a right wing group.
Wasn't racist enough.
Yeah.
Dare I say?
Yeah. It wasn't stereotyping enough, and that I was raising issues of racism in my class for kids to talk about, and up here, the teachers I think taught it. I think they taught it very well, but I think the family, in my judgment, the family had a right to go in there and say, is there another book that the child could read? And our schools were not prepared to have that, because every book, the other 39 books that they had as a choice, none of them addressed none of them was by an author other than a white author that they were not all race issue books either though. So, so it was.
Tell me a little bit more about this ice hockey and getting that started with the kids.
Oh.
Did your son want to play, or did you encourage him to play?
Well, ice hockey was the thing in Madison with the UW ice hockey team going, and my wife and I had team tickets right up to the beginning, and I had 33 family and friends going. We had season tickets at the hockey game. It was the thing to do. It's no longer quite the case, and my son was about, he was about 12, 13, something like that. He was skating and they were playing hockey, so we got the Monona Grove Hockey Association going. And there was a whole league of youth hockey in the area, east side, west side, north side, south side, that sort of thing.
But nothing in the high schools at that point?
Oh yeah, in other high schools had east, west, all the Madison high schools had hockey programs going, and so we sat down one evening with our parents group, and and somebody said, "Why don't we get an ice hockey program going in the high school?" And I said, "Well, why not?" I said, so I went and talked to the athletic director, who was my neighbor, who lives 2 houses up from me, John Clement, and John wasn't supportive. Well, he had other things. It's basketball, and it's money, and why do I want to do this? He wasn't, he just figured he'd say no, and that'd be it. And then I talked to the principal, and of course he asked the athletic director, and so that was no. I figured that would do. Then I talked to the superintendent, and I figured that would be no, but I'd need to touch all the bases so nobody could say I didn't touch all the bases. And he said no. So I went back and we talked to our parents, and they said yes. So we went to the annual meeting. And if you're going to an annual meeting, nobody goes to it except people who have an interest in it. So we brought about 30 people in. Now they knew we were coming, so they brought others in. And so I had to debate my neighbor, John Clement. He gave all the reasons why not, and I gave all the reasons yes. It didn't matter because we had the votes in the public and the audience at the annual meeting. That counts. And so it was, you can't deal with those issues at annual meetings anymore, that kind of issues, but you could then. And so the hockey program was put in on Thursday night, and John Clement brought catalogs of hockey equipment and things like that down to my house before whatever came on for sports at 1 o'clock and on TV, and we went through and we purchased all the hockey equipment for it, and then they hired a graduate from the UW hockey program who was a teacher to teach art at Winnequa School. So they got the hockey coach, and John Clement was a real pro. I mean, he didn't think that wasn't his priority, but he made it work, and that's how the ice hockey team got started in Monona.
Where did you play physically? What rink did you use to play on?
Well, when we had the youth hockey program, any place there could be ice made. When the weather got cold enough, one of the barns at the exhibit barns at the
Coliseum.
not at the Coliseum, but out back where the animals would be shown, they would pour water on the concrete. It was cold enough, so you had corrugated metals like being in a refrigerator when you're inside there. When it got warm, you didn't have ice, but we could use Hartmeyer, and then the Coliseum ice was available at a price. And then they also built another ice arena out at the Coliseum, which there's a little separate building there as you walk in. And today, A lot of people don't know it's an ice arena in there. But then there were a couple of ice arenas built in the area, and they did it. Our kids sometimes practice on the Coliseum ice, and sometimes they would be playing in very cold climate. But
Was your daughter involved in any sports?
yeah, oh yeah, she was involved in high school track and orchestra music. She was mostly in, but she did cross country, and she did the long distance running for the track team. She wasn't competitive, but she liked doing it. And when she went to college, she wanted to go to a college where she could do that without getting cut from the team.
Oh.
So she went to St. Olaf. She didn't mind being last as long as she could compete. It was interesting because that wasn't my personality,
Right.
but it was. And then my son went to play ice hockey, and he played at Eau Claire. He played at Stevens Point for a year, and then he played at Eau Claire in Division III hockey for the last 3 years.
Okay, good.
He wasn't in the higher rung of college hockey, but he played. So.
Did you continue sports as an adult?
Did I?
You were pretty busy otherwise, I must admit.
Well, not really. I played adult softball or baseball from time to time, and that sort of thing. But I was too busy with my career, and my right throwing arm was I cannot. I had it injured in college to where my kids will tell me I throw like a girl, which is the biggest insult that you could get, But I do. I cannot throw a ball correctly with my right arm, and I was a baseball player in high school. So I hit it. My biggest thrill. I wasn't any big champion or anything, but my biggest thrill was in a high school championship playoff game, I hit a double off the wall of Wrigley Field in Los Angeles, which looks just like Wrigley Field, and it was a brick wall with ivy, just like Wrigley Field, because it was Los Angeles Angels were the what do you call it, the minor league team of the Chicago Cubs at the time, and but that's my only claim to fame. But it's but I got involved with a lot of things at the Department of Public Instruction for a while, and at the university I did a lot of things internationally and things like that. And when for a few years Monona had a sister city in Belize. I don't know if you knew that.
Yes.
And I was part of that, getting that going. But the person who really sparked that was a woman who lived here for a very short period of time. I don't know if we ever found her. I can't remember her name. My wife would know it. But she lived here probably for 4 or 5 years. And it was her idea and had a connection and things like that. And so we had a whole group that went down there and Shropshires and everybody, and we visited our sister city Dangriga, and then it was active for, I would say, 4 or 5 years, and then nothing happened. It faded away. My wife and the library group kept it going for probably another 10 years with the library there, and we shipped library books, and then my wife and I, we went down and visited too, again. But then the shipping costs of library books and that sort of thing got to be, and then it kind of, that faded away, and so it hasn't existed for many years. You got anything more on me I don't know? I think the the most technology I ever worked with is that I was the cryptographic officer for the 2nd Marine Division. I did the I had the what you would call popularly the Enigma machine, you know.
The Enigma machine.
And I never thought I would ever be doing something like that. But I got my first assignment after I finished my officer training, and that's when I was a young 2nd lieutenant, you know, 22, 23 years old, and I got assigned to the 2nd Marine Division in Camp Lejeune, North Carolina, and I happened to I had a room in an officer's quarters, and there was a swimming pool outside. And I got talking, and one of my MOSs, you know, MOS is military occupational specialties. Military personnel have, if you've been in the military, you know what your MOSs were. You know, you were artillery or communications or a cook or whatever it was, whatever it would be. So one of mine was communications, and so I met the communications officer, and he arranged for me to get his job because he was leaving it to take another one. So I ended up being in charge of the communications center of the 2nd Marine Division as a lieutenant, which was really supposed to be for a captain at least. And I had about 10 people on teletypewriters sending and receiving messages.
Okay.
But when they came in encrypted, not all messages were encrypted. A lot of them were just, how are you, that sort of thing. But when they came in encrypted, I had to go back into a vault, open the doors, get out this, and I call it an Enigma machine. And I had to look at the calendar and the date that says of the 12 wheels, which wheels I had to put in and where I had to start each wheel. So you had, you know, billions of permutations and combinations of it. And then I had to decode a secret message that's saying that General Smith is moving from San Antonio to Washington, you know, something like that.
Oh, that's.
But I had to deal with that at the time of the West crisis too. So anyway.
So to kind of close up and finish up here, what are you most proud of in terms of your relationship to the city of Monona, and or what would you like people to remember you for having done for the city of Monona?
Oh gosh. I just think that the city of Monona has been the result of the work of an awful lot of people over several generations, and I just think of myself as making probably a good contribution during several years of that, and continuing making this a great community and schools and that sort of thing. And I think if I had to pinpoint anything is that I probably modernize and put in a modern perspective of finance and things like that, and policy making, the dream that a lot of the pioneers had for the city.
Bringing it up to date and into the more modern era, so to speak.
Integrating it into the new changes in public finance and the laws and that sort of thing. You know, I mean, I look at all the things that we look at, and they were done by the pioneers to some extent. You know, I mean, but it's been a lot of, you know, I think every mayor's dealt with. I know every mayor's dealt with his library, particularly. I know when I became mayor, I was told that you're going to have problems with the elevator, you know, and
sure enough.
But I think the contribution I made to the library was to assure that it would be run by a professional librarian. That's what I did.
Well, and in other departments as well.
Yes.
the professionalizing.
I had a professionally trained city administrator come in, and I did it with the fire department. The police department was pretty much that way, and I think if I left any heritage in the city, it was to begin to modernize, professionalize what had been kind of taken for granted and so forth, and I think much of that has been continued.
Did the city of Monona grow in population a lot while you were here?
I don't think so. I think it reached its peak at about 12,000, somewhere along there, but
Because it's fairly landlocked, which
no, it is landlocked. It's surrounded, and
limits the growth, physical growth.
yeah, and it's in the areas where we created a kind of industrial commercial area down at where the old airport was at one time. I guess we're going to have to find out something to do with that down there.
Again.
So it was, but that was Rita Wlodarczyk's thing to have she wanted to have a shopping center down there with a movie theater, which we had at one time. They had a movie theater in there. I think that came and went pretty fast. It didn't have much attraction to it, but it was there shortly.
Okay. Yeah, well, thank you so very, very much for coming in again, and
Oh, happy to do it, and
appreciate your time.
Next project.